Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the early positive school or positivist school perspectives of criminality. And this is going to be what we consider the early school biological theories of crime. You're going to see that there's a newer school of biosocial theory of crime that we're going to discuss in a future lecture, but this was kind of the beginnings. And the reason why well, not kind of, this was the beginnings. And one of the things we're going to see here is where it really started in the time periods that we're looking at, especially when we're still in some of these early times of human behavior and understanding, we're really looking at where technology is advancing. And by the early to mid 1800s, science had become so prominent, particularly the use of the scientific method had become so prominent. And a lot of individuals turned their thoughts to the picture of why were people committing crimes. And you see the first two, cranometry and phrenology, were actually focused on the human head, or particularly the brain. Now, what is included in your learning management system for this week is actually a separate video lecture put together that looks at phrenology in detail. And that's mostly because I thought, honestly, it was quite well done, including some of the graphics that were being used. But for the purpose of this recording, I will mention that there was a theory and idea with these individuals who were approaching cranometry and phrenology, which is this idea of trying to measure the human brain as by the size of the skull. So obviously they weren't cutting people's heads open; they were just measuring their skull while they were alive, and asserting that certain not only head sizes but head shapes and nose lengths and shapes and ears length and shapes presented whether an individual could be considered trustworthy, for example, so someone you would even want to marry, or an individual could be considered untrustworthy. And it all started out of this idea in science that even though individuals are varied and they're different, there might be some uniformity to as why some people commit crimes. And it could be their personality, which phrenology argued was centered in the brain, right? That the brain was the central place for all kinds of things, including they basically in phrenology, you'll see in the layout of the video, they actually broke down the human brain into sections, not by how we know the human brain to be now, but what they thought was different centers or what they call locuses of personality. So whether a person was untrustworthy or trustworthy, happy or angry, they gave different meanings to different sections of the brain. But where we're going to go for this lecture in more detail is with Cesare Lombroso, an Italian theorist and doctor from 1835 to 1909. And Lombroso particularly was looking at live criminals, but he also was able to get a hold of obviously some bodies back then because the control and regulation of human remains in science wasn't as strong as it should have been, particularly when you're talking about Italian culture where the Catholic Church was heavily prominent and they didn't want to have desecration of not only human remains, but desecration of the graves, for example. But there was a lot of grave robbing going on. He started to basically draw pictures of what he was seeing on these people who their bodies were coming from the prisons. And what he found was particularly, and you'll see as we go along, that these individuals were different from the rest of us. And part of that is because he was finding a very common type of body features and physical characteristics in these individuals. He actually borrowed from Darwin, right? So Charles Darwin does have a legacy in criminology. Charles Darwin's legacy in criminology builds out even further into, as you'll see later on in this lecture, some very tragic aspects of criminology. But we do consider Lombroso to be the modern father, at least on the scientific end, of criminological thought. And when we address that, what many criminologists will state is that Lombroso wasn't perfect for his time, right? He was a medical doctor. The scientific method back then wasn't as good as it should be. the application of what was his theories by politicians wasn't as measured as it should have been. So basically, it was imperfect work, but it was good for its time. So we do recognize as criminologists that they're, like anything else, like any other science or thought and discipline, there could be problems with, what we're doing. There could be problems with our how we're structuring our ideas. You can see here he gave us two of our first sets of definitions, criminaloids and boring criminals. And the criminaloids, particularly in Italian society, were individuals who did not commit serious offenses. They were just individuals who got arrested for petty things. So then he said the ones who were the most serious and violent were these so-called born criminals. And these were the ones he really wanted people to avoid, right? And he wanted individuals to be almost fearful of them. He wrote his main theory of crime in a book published in 1876 called The Criminal Man. And it brought together this craniometry, phrenology, and then physiognomy, which is this, again, looking at the structure of the human head, but then also the human body to try and understand, are there people who are just different from the vast majority of us, from the rest of us? He coined a term called atavism. And this is, as you see here, basically saying that they're almost Neanderthal-like. If you can see the definition on your slide, I don't really need to read it to you, but that these individuals are so Neanderthal-like or so whatever you would consider modern humans to be, that their behaviors is often, he would argue, not correctable. It is often behaviors that are going to continue to devolve into problematic and risky behavior to eventually, with the born criminals, they're going to be the violent and murderous members of society. He actually would change up his variants over time. And when we talk about his stigmata, this is not how we understand it in, obviously, the Catholic faith, with the presentation of wounds to match Jesus Christ crucifixion on the cross. This is actually where he states the stigmata of this is what a person you should look at them and say these are individuals that you should be worried are a possible criminal. And you can see the examples on the type of face, the type of ears, the lips, their nose, their chin, and the rest of their body. I think it's best shown by actually looking at some of Lombroso's drawings in and of himself that are publicly available on the internet in this modern era. So let's take a look at them. You can see here the individual that Lombroso is stating is one of the more serious criminals, or the criminaloids, has long ears, a more sloping eyebrow, or you can see this here with a more sloping eyebrow area and forehead, but a particular type of skull, a particular type of chin and lips, and longer noses. He even drew the so-called criminal woman, and he stated they would have pointed noses and pursed lips. And he also said that there were some individuals who were basically misshapen, almost. He also took detailed drawings of things like tattoos and marks on the rest of the body, including length of the arms, average length of the arms, and legs, and stated that these are individuals that obviously were the criminals that he was talking about. So let's go back to our slides. And this is Lombroso's legacy. We do reject it, but he is given a title of Father of Criminology. And this is also why we list him as the first real main theorist in the positivist school of criminology. He also stated that it wasn't just biology, however. He gave us a measure of what we call determinism. And you can see there, how that is explored in the particular definition. And what he was also arguing too is he was applying some aspects of faith as well to it, that there was in essence a pathway written out for individuals, that there was something that was beyond their control. And in this instance, it would be a lot of biology that would lead them to be criminals. And policy wise, he really showed the way in terms of stigmatizing children, basically saying that because these individuals were born with visible features that could be stigmatized, these were individuals that you wanted to watch as they grew older. So obviously the policy implication is almost a pre-crime aspect. Don't trust that these children are going to stay law-abiding members of society in the future. They are ones that you need to watch closely because they're likely going to be criminals. And you can see some of the instances in children where he stated, particularly their tongue, their ears, and their earlobes, you need to watch for them going down the line. Eventually, what occurred in response to Lombroso looking at the human body was going back to the brain and looking at IQ. And it was developed in France, as you can see here. Now, they wanted to start with children, right? Because there was the perception that as you started early on with the interventions for children with education, particularly understanding what their base IQ level is, you can determine whether they were, in essence, going to be able to be trained and how should they be trained and schooled. Now, it did believe the IQ could change, but it did state that there was obviously some issues with some children to where they might not be able to change their IQ. You will notice that we do still use some measures of IQ testing, even in the modern era, but we're very quick to avoid stigmatizing individuals based off of their base level IQ because we now know in the modern era that education is a complex picture and it's not just what you're born with, it's how hard you work and how, and also particularly how adaptable you are to changing certain behaviors, including developing healthy habits for studying and research that show that you could eventually become much smarter in terms of training from whether it's hands-on applications for individuals who work with their hands to individuals who work in education. You can become obviously greater than what we'd say the sum of your base level IQ. This was used by H. Goddard. Now, some of you are going to notice that name and state is that the Goddard School today. We actually don't have any connection to the Goddard School today here, but H. Goddard crafted a particularly a statement that became used in the United States as part of eugenics. It was called feeble-mindedness. It wasn't just individuals who had low IQs. He also lumped in individuals with personality disorders and also individuals who had psychiatric disorders. So he wasn't just dealing with children who might have actually genuinely had developmental disorders or individuals who genuinely had developmental disorders as we know them today. He was talking about everyone. And because H. Goddard was considered so authoritative on IQ testing in the United States, legislatures started to listen to his theories and ideas and started to propose that the feeble-minded needed to be basically cold in some measure, and that would be through forced sterilization. This did not just occur in Europe, particularly in Nazi Germany, like most individuals are often either taught in school, unfortunately, or come to believe by things that they read on the internet. As a matter of fact, in this week as well, what is afforded to you is a video, particularly a video lecture that looks at uh, sterilization processes that occurred in the state of North Carolina until the 1970s in the United States, where they were sterilizing individuals who were considered feeble-minded, and they went so far as to sterilize individuals based off of their socioeconomic status, or whether they were poor or if they were minority individuals. He gave a couple different levels of feeble-mindedness, as you can see here, and he classified them as to whether they had the lowest or low intelligence. And particularly, he wrote one of the most disturbing quotes that was ever presented in criminological theory, that because morons were such a serious threat and that they could later on produce children who became the idiots or even imbeciles, and as he states, as you see on the slide, slip through the cracks and reproduce. He called for saving basically society from itself and humanity from itself by getting rid in some measure of these individuals and ensuring that they don't reproduce. We stop their genetic lineage in its place. That is the history of eugenics criminology. And it's why when we go on to look at the biosocial school of criminology, you often hear me say that biosocial criminologists today recognize the history of the early biological theories, recognize the impact of what can happen when the policies are taken too far, but make a huge point to try and avoid any strong statements like what H. Goddard placed, so we can avoid the history of eugenics. He also particularly was put in responsibility for monitoring individuals who came through Ellis Island. So he was so well respected that he actually could decide whether your relatives could be forced to be turned back when they came through Ellis Island when they came here to the United States. And we know that the late 1800s and the early 1900s into World War II and past World War II, there was a massive influx of immigrants from European nations like Ireland and Italy, but also all over Europe and all over the world. And he actually caused a greater increase of people to be turned away at Ellis Island because he just labeled them as feeble-minded. And one of the lasting legacy of H. Goddard is United States Supreme Court decision called Buck versus Bell, where it actually allowed for individuals in the United States, particularly in this instance in the Commonwealth of Virginia, they could be sterilized medically, so they could not reproduce. Now, we did not obviously launch into initiatives like what Nazi Germany did, where they threw people into concentration camps and killed them, but we did medically sterilize people in the United States. So these are some very troubling legacies of this early school criminology. And the sad part about it, other than the horror of eugenics, is that later on in life, H. Goddard stated that through many measures, including mandatory schooling and better schools, individuals' intelligence levels could possibly be increased. So, where he had once written that they were lost causes and humanity needed to stop them, he eventually believed that they could be, obviously, in some essence, he kind of used the word redeemed. Moving on, what also came through a theory of somatyping is William Sheldon's body type theory. So basically, he looked at the tissue layer of human beings, and you can see them here laid out, the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm, and stated that there were somatypes of human beings, that in essence, based off of bone structure and the size of the individual, including height and weight, that individuals would be classified as either an endomorph, a mesomorph, or an ectomorph. Now, the endomorph, the first picture you see here, pulled out of the textbook, is an individual with basically what he classifies a soft body, often a larger midsection,
individuals who had just basically like excess body fat throughout their body. And he stated, as it says here in the image, that they have personality traits around problems with evenness of emotions, but they more in general were basically good humored people. In essence, kind of like Santa Claus, a bowl full of jelly for his stomach. It's this idea of a more just relaxed person. The mesomorph was the individual who was more muscular. So you see here from the figure there, obviously this figure, this person shown here is more muscular defined. Now here there, he stated because they were more muscularly defined, they were more likely to be dominant individuals. They were more likely to be indifferent to what others think, and they were more physically active and competitive. So the concern there is this is actually building into when we talk about psychological theories of crime, more like a basically a psychopath, right? Where the individuals are basically callous and unemotional and often would have little concern about what others think about them and would be so unthinking about the future that they would be engaged in risky behavior. He wasn't really, it didn't list them as psychopaths, but it could be considered an application. And then the ectomorph, the individual who was more, apologies, who was more thin, and they basically have a larger brain as well, he would say, so they have more light build. And he said there that they're more likely to be more basically meek people. They had social anxiety, they were mentally intense, and just kind of self conscious. So this should also sound familiar because William Sheldon's body type theory of the endomorph, the ectomorph, and the mesomorph did eventually develop into body mass index typing, which we still use today, which looks at obviously the level, your height and your weight compared to your weight, and determining a base level percentage of your body mass, outside of whether you have muscle or not, to determine whether you're underweight at basically a good stable weight, overweight, or obese, or now I think the classifications go all the way up to extreme obesity. So there is a long-lasting legacy even with some of these theories outside of criminology, and that's a common factor that we see because obviously, these were some of these theories were individuals working in the medical field, and his policy implications required not only that these individuals be screened at birth for personality traits that could be problematic, but also too argued for things such as schooling should have only certain children by the same biological sex. So all women in math, all males in English, for example. And obviously we saw with, outside of Sheldon, we saw with H. Goddard, we still used IQ testing for children, and there was a lot of screening for toxins. So this is the early school of biological understanding of criminology, and I hope that it benefits you in understanding what's written in the textbook.